For 50 years, millions of people looked at Louis Armstrong's face. They saw the smile that became synonymous with joy itself. They saw the sweat glistening under stage lights during sold-out performances at Carnegie Hall and the Hollywood Bowl. They saw the trumpet pressed against his lips in countless photographs, the wrinkles deepening around his eyes when he laughed on film, the white handkerchief he used to wipe his brow between songs. Magazine covers captured his grin. Movie cameras filmed his performances in intimate close-up. Television brought his face into living rooms across America and around the world. But there was something they did not see, something hidden in plain sight across thousands of photographs, hundreds of performances, decades of close-up filming. A scar, deep jagged, running from the corner of his mouth partway down his chin. A scar that told a story Louis Armstrong spent his entire professional life making sure nobody would ask about. This is the story of what happened on a New Orleans street when Louis was 7 years old, and how that single moment of violence shaped not just his face, but every photograph, every performance, every public appearance for the next 5 decades. New Orleans, July 1908. Louis Armstrong was 7 years old, small for his age, thin from inconsistent meals, living with his mother man in a neighborhood where survival required constant vigilance. The streets of the battlefield district earned their name honestly. Violence was casual, frequent, expected. Fights broke out over territory, insults, money, or nothing at all. Louis had learned to navigate this landscape the way other children learn to read, developing instincts about which corners to avoid, which adults were dangerous when drunk, when to run and when to freeze. He knew the rhythms of street life, could read body language, understood the difference between bluster and genuine threat. But on a sweltering afternoon in July, all those carefully learned instincts failed him in a moment that would mark him for life. He was walking home from delivering laundry for his mother, earning a few precious coins that would help buy food that week. The bundle of clean clothes had been delivered successfully. The coins jingled in his pocket. Louis was thinking about whether they would have enough for red beans that night, maybe even a little meat if they were lucky. He was not paying attention to the three figures who had been tracking him for 2 blocks, waiting for the right moment when no adults were watching. By the time Louis noticed them blocking his path, it was already too late to run. He knew these boys. They were older, maybe 11 or 12, part of a loose gang that controlled certain streets. They had never bothered him before, but today was different. Today he had money, and they knew it. The leader, a boy named Raymond with a scar of his own across his eyebrow, demanded the coins. Louis's first instinct was to comply. Money was replaceable, even if losing it meant his mother would go without that night. But something in Raymond's tone, something mocking and cruel, made 7-year-old Louis hesitate. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the thought of disappointing his mother. Maybe it was just the stubborn resistance of a child who had so little that giving up even a few coins felt like surrender. Whatever the reason, Louis did not immediately hand over the money. He clutched the coins tighter in his fist and took a step backward. That step changed everything. Raymond lunged forward, grabbing for Louis's pocket. Louis twisted away, and suddenly all three boys were on him, hands grabbing, fists swinging, Louis trying to protect both the coins and himself. In the scuffle, he did not see the broken bottle, did not see Raymond pick it up from the gutter where it had been lying in pieces of green glass, did not see the arc of Raymond's arm as he swung wildly, angry now, wanting to hurt rather than just rob. Louis felt the impact before he understood what happened. A sharp, burning pain across his face, heat, then wetness streaming down his chin, dripping onto his shirt. His hand went to his face and came away covered in blood. The boys scattered, Raymond dropping the bottle, all three running in different directions, leaving Louis standing alone on the street with blood pouring from a gash that ran from the corner of his mouth down toward his chin. The scream that came from Louis brought neighbors to their windows. Mrs. Jackson from 2 doors down reached him first, took one look at the wound, and ran for Mayan. Louis's mother arrived at a full run, saw her son's bloodied face, and for a moment her expression showed pure rage. She wanted to hunt down the boys who did this, wanted to make them pay, but that rage lasted only seconds before practicality took over. Her child was bleeding. That was the only thing that mattered now. She scooped Louis up despite his protests that he was too old to be carried, and brought him home, his blood soaking into her dress. Mayan Armstrong had no money for a doctor. Even if she had money, most doctors in New Orleans in 1908 would not treat a black child for anything less than critical injury, and even then, reluctantly, she had to handle this herself. She laid Louis on the kitchen table, wiped away enough blood to see the extent of the damage, and felt her heart sink. The cut was deep, the edges ragged from the broken glass. It needed stitches, professional care, treatment she could not provide. But she had whiskey for cleaning, needle and thread for sewing, and the iron will of a mother who would not let her child's face be permanently disfigured if she could help it. What followed was an ordeal Louis would remember in nightmares for years. His mother's hands holding his face steady, the burning pain of whiskey in the wound, his own screaming, the feel of the needle-piercing skin, Mayan's tears falling on his face as she worked, her hands shaking but never stopping. She pulled the wound closed as best she could, making small, careful stitches, trying to align the torn edges. But she was not a doctor. The stitches were uneven. The edges did not match perfectly, and when infection set in 2 days later, turning the wound hot and swollen, all she could do was clean it repeatedly and pray. The wound eventually healed, but badly. The scar tissue was thick, raised darker than the surrounding skin. It pulled at the corner of Louis's mouth, creating an asymmetry that was subtle but impossible to miss once noticed. The scar ran nearly 2 inches, a permanent testament to 3 boys, a broken bottle, and a mother's desperate attempt to save her son's face with kitchen whiskey and sewing thread. For the rest of his childhood, that scar defined how people saw Louis. Other children asked about it constantly. Did it hurt? How did he get it? Was he in a fight? Louis learned to deflect these questions, learned to turn his head in conversations, learned to smile in a way that minimized the scar's visibility. But it was always there, always the first thing people noticed when they met him. When Louis began playing trumpet seriously as a teenager, he discovered that the scar created an unexpected technical problem. The scar tissue had no elasticity. Normal skin stretches and contracts with the movements of facial muscles. Scar tissue does not. When Louis pressed the trumpet mouthpiece against his lips, the rigid scar tissue could not adapt to the pressure the way healthy skin did. He had to adjust his embouchure completely, the positioning of his mouth on the instrument, to work around this limitation. He experimented for months, trying different angles, different amounts of pressure, different ways of shaping his lips around the mouthpiece. The traditional approach that other trumpet players used was physically impossible for him. The scar simply would not allow it. Some music historians have speculated that Armstrong's revolutionary sound was partly born from this constraint. His unique way of shaping notes, his particular tone, the innovative techniques that set him apart from every other trumpet player of his generation, all developed because he physically could not play the instrument the way others did. The scar forced innovation. It demanded creativity. Louis had to invent new techniques because the standard ones were closed to him. But he never told anyone this, never explained that part of his genius was born from necessity, from working around damaged tissue on his face. To admit that would be to tell the story of the scar, and that was a story he had decided the world did not need to know. As Armstrong's career began gaining momentum in the early 1920s, he became increasingly conscious that appearance mattered in ways that had nothing to do with musical talent. He was not just a musician, he was a performer, an entertainer, a face that would appear in newspapers and eventually on film. He was also a black man in an industry controlled by white gatekeepers, performing primarily for white audiences. He understood, with a clarity that came from hard experience, that his value to those audiences was partly in appearing safe, joyful, uncomplicated. A visible scar from a street fight told the wrong story. It spoke of violence, poverty, danger. It spoke of a world most white audiences preferred not to acknowledge. Armstrong knew instinctively that his success depended on managing his image carefully, and the scar had to be part of that management. His first attempts at concealment were crude. He used dark makeup, applying it heavily to the scar area, trying to create the illusion of uniform skin tone. But early theatrical makeup was thick, obvious under the hot stage lights that were standard in the 1920s. Photographs from this period, if examined closely with modern tools, show the scar faintly visible despite the makeup, a slightly darker patch where the tissue was thicker. Armstrong became obsessed with lighting during performances. He learned which angles made the scar more visible and which cast it in shadow. He began positioning himself deliberately on stage, always turning slightly to present his left side more prominently to audiences and cameras. The right side of his face, where the scar was more pronounced, stayed angled away. Photographers who worked with him noticed this consistent positioning, but assumed it was vanity, a performer's natural preference for his good side. They had no idea it was strategic concealment developed through years of practice. Everything changed when Armstrong hired Helen Williams as his personal makeup artist in 1935. Helen was a black woman in her late 30s who had worked in theater for 15 years. She understood both the technical challenges of makeup under various lighting conditions and the particular pressures faced by black performers trying to control their image in a white, dominated industry where every aspect of appearance was scrutinized and judged. When Lewis first approached her about the position, he was direct about his primary requirement. He showed her the scar, explained that it needed to be invisible in photographs and under stage lights, and asked if she could do it. Helen studied his face for several minutes in silence, then asked a single question: "Does anyone else need to know why?" Lewis shook his head. "Good," Helen said. "Then let's get to work." Helen approached the problem with scientific precision. She photographed Armstrong's face under different types of lighting, from different angles, at different distances. She studied how the scar tissue reflected light differently than surrounding skin, how its texture created subtle shadows that drew the eye. She experimented with makeup formulations, mixing custom shades that matched his skin tone exactly. But makeup alone was not enough. The texture difference between scar tissue and healthy skin would always be detectable at close range or under certain lighting conditions. So Helen taught Louis about the mechanics of photography itself. She explained how cameras captured light, how distance affected detail, how certain angles minimized texture while others emphasized it. She worked directly with photographers before shoots, positioning lights and suggesting camera placements that would render the scar invisible. Louis began carrying a small compact mirror to check his appearance before any photograph, making sure the scar area was properly covered and his face positioned correctly. This was not vanity, this was professional necessity. By the 1940s, the concealment system was perfected. Every professional photograph of Louis Armstrong from this period forward was carefully managed. Studio portrait sessions involved Helen setting up the lighting before Louis even entered the room. She would position lights, adjust reflectors, check sight lines from the camera position, all before the photographer arrived. Once shooting began, Helen stood beside the camera, watching, occasionally calling for adjustments so subtle that most people on set did not notice them. A light moved 6 inches. Louis's chin tilted slightly. The camera angle shifted by degrees. Candid photography was less controllable, but Louis had internalized the positioning so completely that even in genuinely unguarded moments, he instinctively angled his face to minimize the scar's visibility. It had become as natural as breathing. His manager, Joe Glazer, understood the importance of this image control and made sure that any photographer working with Armstrong received certain guidelines before the shoot. These guidelines were never explained explicitly. Photographers were simply told that Mr. Armstrong preferred to be photographed from certain angles and had strong preferences about lighting. Most assumed it was professional vanity. None suspected they were participating in a concealment that had been maintained for decades. Lucille Armstrong, Louis's fourth and final wife, whom he married in 1942, became one of the small circle who knew the complete truth. Louis told her about the scar early in their relationship, in a moment of vulnerability that surprised them both. They were alone in his dressing room after a performance, and Louis was removing his makeup. As Helen's work dissolved under cold cream, the scar became visible. Lucille watched in silence as the face she knew from photographs transformed into something slightly different, marked and imperfect. Louis explained the childhood attack, the years of concealment, the constant awareness of camera angles and lighting. He expected Lucille to be shocked or perhaps pitying. Instead, she was angry, not at Louis, but at the world that had made this concealment necessary, at an industry that demanded black performers be perfect, smooth, unthreatening, at audiences who could not be trusted with the simple human truth of a scar earned in childhood poverty. But Lucille's anger quickly transformed into partnership. She became another guardian of the secret, checking Louis's makeup before public appearances, alerting him when the scar area needed touch-ups during long events, running subtle interference with photographers who got too close or too curious without proper preparation. There were close calls over the years, moments when the carefully maintained concealment nearly failed. The most dangerous occurred in 1956 during filming of High Society at MGM Studios. Helen Williams was sick with influenza and sent a substitute makeup artist she had trained personally, but the substitute, nervous about working with a star of Armstrong's stature, applied makeup according to standard MGM protocols rather than Helen's specialized technique. During a particularly intense scene under bright studio lights that ran hot for hours, the makeup began to break down. Armstrong felt it happening, felt the moisture on his face from heat and exertion, felt the makeup shifting. During a break, he checked a mirror and saw what he feared the scar faintly visible, a darker line against his skin. He immediately called for Helen's substitute, had her reapply makeup correctly, and convinced the director that the lighting in the previous take made him look strange. The scene was reshot the next day with Helen herself on set despite her illness. She personally supervised every aspect of Armstrong's makeup and refused to leave until filming was complete. The original footage from the first take was destroyed at Louis's insistence, though it cost him political capital with the studio. Most of the cast and crew never understood what the problem had been. They simply knew that Armstrong had demanded a reshoot for reasons that seemed minor to everyone except him. Another close call came in 1963 when a young photographer for Ebony magazine, eager to get unique shots, arrived early to a scheduled interview and caught Armstrong backstage before Helen had finished his makeup. The photographer, a black woman named Sarah Chen, raised her camera instinctively when she saw Armstrong capturing several frames before Helen stepped between them. In those frames, the scar was clearly visible, a jagged line down Armstrong's face in unforgiving backstage light. Sarah realized immediately that she had photographed something she was not supposed to see. Helen and Louis exchanged a look, then Louis gestured for Sarah to sit down. He explained about the scar, about the concealment, about why it mattered that those photographs not be published. He did not ask her to destroy them. He simply asked her to understand that her career would benefit from cooperation, while publication would harm his. Sarah, who had grown up admiring Armstrong, who understood the pressures of being black in a white industry, agreed without hesitation. The negatives were developed, but never printed. Sarah kept them in her personal archive for decades, never showing them to anyone, a secret she maintained until after Armstrong's death. As Louis aged into his 60s, the physical work of concealing the scar became more difficult. The makeup techniques that had worked flawlessly on younger, more elastic skin did not adhere as well to aged tissue. The scar itself became more prominent as the surrounding skin lost tone and tightened. Helen, also aging, worked constantly to adapt her methods, but they both knew they were fighting a battle against time and biology. During Armstrong's final tours in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Louis relied increasingly on careful positioning and the cooperation of photographers who had worked with him for years and understood without being told what angles to avoid. The effort exhausted him, not just physically, but emotionally. 50 years of turning his head just so. 50 years of checking mirrors compulsively. 50 years of feeling that his actual, unmarked face was somehow unacceptable. In private moments with Lucille during those final years, Louis sometimes talked about the weight of concealment. "I'm tired of it," he told her one evening. "Tired of hiding. Tired of the mirror, the makeup, the angles. Tired of feeling like my face is a problem to be managed." Lucille listened, then asked if he wanted to stop, to simply appear in public without the careful concealment, to let the world see what it had not seen for 5 decades. Louis considered this seriously, but in the end he could not do it. "It's not about shame," he explained. "It's about control. That scar was given to me without my consent. Hiding it is my choice. They don't get to make it mean what they want it to mean. They don't get to tell stories about violence and poverty and turn me into a symbol of suffering. I'm more than that scar. I've always been more." And the hiding proves it. Louis Armstrong died on July 6, 1971 at his home in Corona, Queens. Helen Williams was one of the first people Lucille called with the news. Helen came to the house immediately and performed one final service for her employer and friend. She carefully applied makeup to Louis's face in the coffin, making sure the scar was completely concealed even in death. The technique she used was the same one she had perfected over 36 years of work. At the viewing and funeral, thousands of people filed past the casket. None of them saw the scar. Even in death, Louis Armstrong controlled how he was seen. Helen Williams carried the weight of this secret for 2 more years. In 1973, diagnosed with terminal cancer and facing her own mortality, She began to feel that Armstrong's story deserved to be complete, that the concealment itself was part of his legacy. She wrote a detailed account of her decades working with Louis, explaining the scar, the techniques of concealment, the reasons why it had mattered so deeply to him. She gave this account to Michael Cogswell, a young jazz historian she trusted to handle the information responsibly. Helen died in 1976. The written account sat in Cogswell's files while he debated whether publishing it would violate Armstrong's clear desire for privacy even posthumously, or whether it would provide crucial context for understanding his life and career. The decision was made for him in 1990 when the Louis Armstrong House Museum opened in Corona. Researchers cataloging Armstrong's personal effects found photographs he had kept hidden during his lifetime. Early photos from the 1920s where makeup techniques were less sophisticated and the scar was faintly visible. Personal snapshots from the 1930s where Louis, at home and relaxed, had not bothered with concealment. Medical records from a 1968 examination that noted significant scar tissue lower left face, approximate age 60 years, origin unknown. These discoveries, combined with Helen Williams' written testimony, created a complete documentary record. Michael Cogswell published the full story in 1992, framing it carefully not as scandal or gossip, but as insight into the extraordinary pressures Black entertainers faced and the sophisticated methods they developed to control their public image. The revelation changed how scholars and fans looked at Armstrong's photographic legacy. Suddenly, patterns that had been invisible became obvious. The consistent camera angles, the specific lighting preferences, the way Armstrong's face was almost always positioned to present the left side more prominently. Photography experts began analyzing the thousands of images in Armstrong's archive, finding the telltale signs of concealment in image after image. They marveled at Helen Williams' technical skill, at the precision of the system she and Armstrong had developed. What emerged was profound respect for both the artistry of the concealment and the determination it required to maintain it across 5 decades of relentless public scrutiny. Today, the scar that Louis Armstrong hid for 50 years has become central to how we understand his life and legacy. The concealment reveals the gap between public persona and private reality that all performers navigate, but which was particularly fraught for Black artists in the 20th century. Armstrong had to be talented but humble, successful but not threatening, joyful but not too proud. Every aspect of his public presentation was calculated. The hidden scar was simply the most literal example of this constant work. Understanding this changes how we see his famous smile, his exuberant performances, his carefully crafted public image. None of it was false, but all of it was work. The joy was real. The talent was real. But beneath it was a man who learned at age 7 that the world would judge him for wounds inflicted upon him, and who spent his entire career making sure that judgment never happened. The photographs that show no scar are paradoxically the most revealing documents of his life. They show not just what he looked like, but what he understood about the world he lived in and what he was willing to do to succeed in it on his own carefully controlled terms.